You're listening to the Mindful Mama Podcast, episode 120. Today we're talking to Bob Stahl about how to stay calm in the storm. Welcome to the Mindful Mama Podcast. Here it's about becoming a less irritable, more joyful parent. At Mindful Mama, we know that you cannot give what you do not have. And when you are thriving, when you have calm and peace within, then you can give it to your children. I'm your host, Hunter Clark Fields, Mindful Mama Mentor. I coach overstressed moms on how to cultivate self-awareness in their daily lives to take family and life to a new level of peace and cooperation. I've been practicing yoga and mindfulness for over 20 years. I'm the creator of the Mindful Parenting course, and I'm the mom of two girls ages 8 and 11. Welcome back. Hey, so glad you're here. So glad to connect with you again today. It's a rainy May morning for me, and I'm happy to bring you this wisdom of Bob Stahl. He's so cool. I can't wait for you to hear what he has to say. We're going to talk about calming the rush of panic, and Bob's like this amazing, wise uncle, and he's going to talk to you about, we're going to talk about mindfulness in a really deep and important way. He founded the mindfulness-based stress reduction programs at Dominican Hospital, O'Connor Hospital, and El Camino Hospital in California. He's also co-author of a mindfulness-based stress reduction workbook, Living with Your Heart Wide Open, Calming the Rush of Panic, and a mindfulness-based stress reduction workbook for anxiety. And you can find more about him at mindfulnessprograms.com. But he is a really deep and wise person. And we're going to talk about the power of mindfulness. And for me, this is really apropos at this moment. But first, I'll tell you why. But let me tell you about some of the takeaways you're going to get as we listen to this conversation about how meditation helps us meet the preciousness and fragility of life, right? How it helps us work with change and impermanence, really important stuff. How it helps us with anxiety by really interrupting rumination and giving you more options to deal with it, right? And we also talk about this idea of taking responsibility for ourselves and taking responsibility for our pain. And the idea that if we can get ourselves caught, we can get ourselves uncaught, right? So cool. This power of sort of radical responsibility, which is so cool. So why this is so important to me now? Because I just yesterday finished wrapped up and heard the takeaways and the changes from the women who had just gone through the last round of the Mindful Mama Transformation Coaching Group. And this is my group coaching program. And it's just, I feel like my heart busts open every time that I do this, because the power of women coming together, sisterhood, and the vulnerability and the power of sharing and hearing other people and really deeply knowing and feeling you're not alone as you go through these changes, and then seeing people have more joy, be able to connect more in the world, to be able to improve their relationships with their kids and their partner, and to be able to create these really solid foundations for everything in their life. It's just, it rocks my world. And it's funny because, a lot of us think coaching, what is that? That's not for me. But I invite you to consider that maybe that's just an old way of thinking. We have this one wild and precious life, and if we're irritable with our kids, if we're snapping and we're unhappy, if we're not thriving, you can do something about it. We can take actions and you can get support, and it's not a crazy thing to do. In fact, many of us do. And the power of coming together with a mentor and with fellow sisters on the journey who are in the same place you are, it really makes all the difference in the world in being able to take a leap and make some important changes in your life. And it's funny because sometimes one of the women said oh, I kind of thought I would be a whole different person, but I'm actually more me than I ever was before, and I'm loving and accepting me. Oh, wow. That just rocks me. It's so amazing. So I'm sharing this with you now because my next group is starting up. Actually, I have two groups. I'm going to have an evening group. Yay, finally, for you working mamas. and I have room for 12 women. And if you're listening to this as it podcast comes out in real time, you just have a couple days to join. Just have a couple days. And actually, when you do this time, you're going to join the daily practice program, which is my 28-day immersion for yoga and mindfulness for self-care. And you'll get to go through it with a whole bunch of other people. And you'll get to do this group coaching program that lasts over 5 months. We go all through the summer and we meet and we make I have a system where we do these step-by-step changes, but it's also super, super personal to you. So anyway, before I dive into this conversation with Bob and hear about this wisdom, I invite you to check out mindfulmamamentor.com/group coaching. And if what I'm saying is sounding like, yes, like there's a way, connect with me. Let's figure it out. Let's connect. Let's really make that deeper connection, make those leaps together. I would love that. So mindfulmamamentor.com/group coaching. Have any questions, email me at punter@mindfulmamamentor.com. And now onto this conversation. Hi, Bob. Thanks so much for coming on the Mindful Mama podcast. I'm so glad you could be here today.
Thank you, Hunter. It's nice to be on.
Yes. So I'm fascinated to talk to you because you have a long history with teaching mindfulness and studying meditation and things like that. And I'm curious as to your story. Like, how did this all come about in your own life?
Thank you. That's a longer story, but get to the heart of it. But actually, the early roots of what brought me to practice was experiences of death. And I'll never forget the first time that I realized that I was going to die, and I was 4 years old. And it was just this knowing that things are not going to last. And By the time I was 9, I had lost a younger brother that I shared a room with, my best friend who I played with every day after school. She lived across the street. And then my grandfather who lived downstairs. And this led to a time of deep grief, of course, and confusion and despair. And most of my schooling, early schooling, junior and high school and part of elementary school, was just kind of in a blur. And of course, this was this time of the 60s, and the Beatles were introduced, and they were growing their hair long, and the times were changing. And so there was a lot of things going on in the 60s that led even to more confusion. So eventually, I got into a college in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, undergraduate school, and there I majored in skiing, getting drunk and getting high and trying to have girlfriends.
That sounds like my friend's experience in Vermont at college too.
And after 2 years I flunked out.
Oh no.
And then I was readmitted back on warning, and my mother begged me, is there something that would interest you in school? And I knew that I was not interested in reading, writing, arithmetic, science, history, even though they're wonderful subjects. But I was just so lost, and I had done all of that, and there was just no interest. And somehow she said, well, look in the course catalog. And I saw in the course catalog there was something that perked my interest, and it was called The Wisdom of the East. I couldn't pronounce the words after it with a colon. It said Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Zen. I didn't even know what that was. But the East rang a bell to me because growing up, my family was very fond of going to Chinese restaurants and eating Chinese food. And my early experiences was I just loved being there and loved the food, even like the art and the pictures of the Buddhas and the smells and the sense of, I felt a sense of serenity, and I knew that was from the East. And so I said, well, that was my interest into meditation. That's how I got into that class. And I said, well, I'll check this out. And I'll never forget walking into my first class there, and I had a professor that was there that was sitting on top of his desk in a full lotus position.
Oh my goodness.
Like this before. And he captivated me, his presence, the way that he was so embodied in his life. And so he asked us to begin to read the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, The Way of Life, it means, from Taoism. And I started reading this very small book of 81 different wise sayings, epigrams, and it just spoke to me deeply. I couldn't believe that someone had thought about life in this way. I was never exposed to this type of literature. And I was just amazed. And I got so deep into this book called The Way of Life, the Tao Te Ching, and Bill Jackson, this professor, like just how he was as an example. Like I realized at some point that he knows something, and I wasn't sure what he knew, but I knew this. I knew that I wanted to know what he knew, because how he was living his life was very deeply impressed my heart. And so this was my gateway into meditation practice. And a few years later, I ended up graduating with very good grades, majoring in philosophy and religion and sociology, and ended up going to graduate school in Northern California, where I was introduced to Vipassana meditation, insight meditation, early Buddhism, and have been deeply involved in Vipassana ever since. And there's an earlier period in my life where I lived in a Theravada forest monastery, a Burmese monastery, for 8.5 years. That really was a powerful time to deepen practice. I was there as a layperson, not as a monk, though I had ordained temporarily for a very short period of time, but lived mostly in the monastery as a layperson, taking care of the monks and studying and practicing very intensively meditation.
Wow.
Kind of a long, windy road. After leaving the monastery, I got involved teaching mindfulness and mindfulness-based stress reduction and Vipassana meditation retreats, and been doing this since then.
Wow. So if you could kind of paint a picture of the ways that what you struggled with before you immerse yourself so deeply into meditation and mindfulness, and then what it has brought you after, how would you describe that?
Well, I think the deep pains was the sense of loss, separation, grief, and also I think because of that, I was probably not your regular kid on the block. Uh-huh. And so due to whatever causes and conditions, I was in an area where I was bullied and picked on a lot. I was actually one of the only Jews in a non-Jewish area. I remember going home when I was 5 years old, asking my parents what a kike meant. And so I experienced a lot of challenges in those times. And, and wanting to fit in like other kids, I was told that I was different. And also, of course, I'd lost a brother and a best friend and a grandfather, and trying to figure out what is this life in the 1960s. And so, there was a lot of earlier deep pain and like, who am I? What is this? And also just really looking at my own sense of where do I find the sense of wanting to fit in and feeling alienated or separated or disconnected. And I think part of my meditation journey has really been realizing that you can't find that approval outside of you. It needs to be found inside of you. That's been a very deep learning as well. But learning how to meet life, the fragility, the preciousness of this life, because we know it can take a turn at any moment, at any time. That's one of the things I really like about the teachings of the Dharma. There's actually practices on the mindfulness of death and practices on really beginning to meet impermanence, and how do we begin to work with change, with the unreliable nature of things, and learn how to go with life rather than trying to control it or fight it.
I love that. I think that you had this amazing, very unique experience of, so much death as a young person, and it clearly shaped you in so many ways. It's interesting. I mean, because I share a fascination with death. I'm sitting in a room actually right now that has a number of skulls in it that I've painted in my journey in painting and looking at death. And my mother's a hospice nurse, so it's always been something that's been kind of like in my life. And so how do you think it has helped you? So you're saying that your meditation journey has helped you with how to meet life and see the preciousness and fragility of life in a day-to-day way. Do you think it had changed the way you meet life in a very day-to-day way?
Absolutely. But also just to say, my wife is a hospice nurse and chaplain, so we share that.
Yeah. Oh, man. Bless the hospice nurses. Oh, my goodness.
Right. We actually met through a hospice. That's how we found each other. But that's another story. But yes, this practice informs my everyday life. And, the heart of this practice of mindfulness, why do we practice mindfulness? So from the Buddhist tradition, and from the teachings in the Dharma, it's about living with greater peace, greater ease. Mindfulness is a practice of the body, the mind, the heart, to understand about suffering and its causes and the path to great freedom. And so I've been deeply involved with these practices for many years. And so there is the formal practices of mindfulness where we might be doing sitting meditation and other, bringing mindfulness to different day-to-day activities. So there's a practice of being stationary and doing more of a formal guided sitting meditation practice, but there's the informal practices of bringing mindfulness in our life. But these teachings are pointing to how to live our lives with more peace, with more freedom, with less suffering. And so it's not limited to just sitting on the cushion. The practice is our whole life. You could say in many ways that our life is the meditation hall, and what comes up in our life is our practice. And in particular, if indeed one is interested in lessening suffering, then we have to include our whole life in this, because there's things in our life that come up that get us activated, things that pull us off our center, things that we hold on to and grasp, we want to keep forever. There's other things we just want to push away and have nothing to do with. There's times where we're not seeing clearly into what's happening. And so the practice is really how it informs the day-to-day life, is to be aware in my day-to-day life with my interpersonal relationships and everything else, is where are the places where I get stuck? Where are the places where I get caught? Where am I holding on? Where am I pushing away? Where am I not seeing clearly? This is the meditation practice that's brought into all of life.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think that in general in life, when we come to these places where we get stuck and we want to grasp and hold on to things, maybe before any exposure to mindfulness or any way of dealing with it, seems like sort of the general way of dealing with those things is like, either like it comes down to kind of two questions, like what's wrong with you or this, or what's wrong with me, right? And from the perspective of mindfulness, we look at it in a really different way, right?
That's right. We're actually learning to take responsibility to our pain, for our pain. We're taking responsibility that we can begin, if we begin to get ourselves caught, we can begin to get ourselves uncaught. And so actually Pema Chodron, a Tibetan teacher, has this beautiful teaching about, for people that are spiritual warriors, people who want to know the truth, people who want to lessen suffering, things that are considered to be bad news by many people, such as anger, sadness, fear, jealousy, shame, confusion, fear, and so forth. For many people in the worldly sense, this is bad news. But for those that are spiritual warriors, for those who want to know the truth, those who want to suffer less, it's not bad news. It's actually good news, because it's showing you, yes, she says sometimes with terrifying clarity, exactly where you are stuck and where you actually need to bring more attention to rather than less, to begin to take responsibility for ourselves. This is one of the wonderful things I like about the teachings within mindfulness, is this invitation to see for ourselves with our own experience, and that and there's also a powerful teaching that our mind is the creator of our own heavens and our own hells through our own thoughts. And so we're beginning to take responsibility for our minds and our thoughts, and how that we can create our own heavens and our own hells, and we can begin to work on ourselves in a powerful way, a transformative way.
I love that idea of we take responsibility for ourselves. It's really interesting because it's an idea that's come up twice in my day today. And I just finished working with a client who I coached with for a year, and she brought up that term responsibility, like taking responsibility for her well-being, and through the practices of mindfulness. And I really think that idea of responsibility is such a good one, because then it's less about sort of blaming others and things like that. And in the work that I do with parents, sometimes I think of it like, gosh, like it's interesting because you are actually a person who's gone into a forest retreat for like 8 years in practice. And so occasionally I kind of make the joke that like parenting is like better than 10 years on a mountain retreat practicing.
I agree. I'm a father of 2.
Oh, great. So, this is wonderful, Bob. We can compare. You're the perfect person to compare for
this
us.
Is the advanced practice of getting married and having children, I'll tell you.
Yes. Yeah. So that's interesting. So you went off to the forest monastery, I assume, before you had kids.
Yep.
And I assume you found lots of places you were stuck to work with there.
Yeah. Our kids are great teachers and also a partner.
Yeah. And then you have 2 kids, and they showed you lots of places where you were stuck too.
Oh, yeah. They continue to.
Wow. How would you say that your mindfulness has informed your parenting and your journey as a father, as a husband?
Yeah, it's been quite a ride, and so grateful for it. They have this such a human experience to have children and to be a partner and to show up when it's hard, to show up when it's good, to show up, and such a powerful practice. And I'm so grateful for it. And you're seeing yourselves, your own shortcomings. I remember once yelling at my oldest son to stop yelling at my younger son, and then wondering where he learned to yell. And humble pie, humble teaching. So there will be times no doubt we'll fuck up. And so, this is a very powerful teaching of walking back in that room after you've just shamed your child and say to them, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Because due to my own conditioning, my own fear, my own pain, or just, I just want to have a cup of coffee, be left alone for a minute. So the practice of being with children is a practice of constantly letting go and to be with what's there. But there's great rewards because they're just marvelous. And I've learned so much. And, particularly as I understand from the practices of mindfulness, that our identity is composed of the conditioning that has happened before it. And so primary in our early years, the developmental experiences that begin to form our sense of identity and personality are incredibly important. And if we've been brought up in places where we've been shamed constantly, made to feel small, made to feel inadequate, these formative experiences inform potentially a lifetime of such sense of lack of self-esteem, of unworthiness. I remember once working with a woman recently that was told by her mother that I wish I never had you. That's a very powerful statement, of course. And this woman's done a lot of tremendous healing work in some ways, to give birth to herself, to recognize her own beauty within this world. But we have strong conditioning that was created through our upbringings. So our responsibility as parents, actually, I love John Kabat-Zinn and Mila Kabat-Zinn, husband and wife. They wrote a very beautiful book called Everyday Blessings, The Art of Mindful Parenting. And John, of course, is the founder of mindfulness-based stress reduction. But in this book, Everyday Blessings, they speak about three very important qualities to bring up our children. One is acceptance. The other is empathy, which I think for many of us we can understand. And the third one was an unusual term at first until I read more about what they meant. It was called sovereignty, and that means to honor the sovereign nature of our children. And when you think about it, when babies and infants, we are so sovereign in the sense that we have no sense of shame or self-diminishment. If I'm in front of a group of 1,000 people and I have to poop, I'm just going to poop, and I could care less what anyone else thinks. If I want to laugh or fart or eat or cry, like babies just so much just being baby, and that's just what they do. And of course, we get civilized, we get grown up, and we learn to, you only poop here, and you do this here, and that's probably some good reasons behind all that, of course, too. But at the same time, we can get smashed. We can begin to lose our sovereign nature. I remember growing up, I used to have an uncle that used to think it was funny when I'd go over to my grandmother's house to go get, and my grandmother knew I liked peanuts, and I'd go get some, to be a bowl of peanuts, and he would always make an announcement, here comes the claw, here comes the claw. And after a while, I just felt so ashamed. Like I didn't want to go to that bowl anymore. I didn't want my uncle to make fun of me. There's so many things that happen in our early childhood development, shaming or not being included, and so many things that we become, partially the walking wounded. And so the importance of helping to preserve our child's sovereignty, as well as perhaps beginning to learn and develop our own sovereign nature that perhaps we have lost through these years of being shamed or humiliated, not made to feel special or important.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think that when we look at kind of the prevailing kind of styles of parenting, I think the sort of prevailing authoritarian style really totally disregards our children's sovereignty. It doesn't see them as whole people and expects them to just jump up and do what we say as soon as we say it, even though we don't expect that from anyone else in our lives. And then the other style, like the opposite swing of that pendulum is where some parents are afraid of falling into that harmful authoritarian patterns, so they don't own their own sovereignty, right? So they don't create those healthy boundaries and those healthy boundaries for their children, for themselves. So it's interesting. I like that idea of sovereignty kind of as a thing to bring up into parenting. So he said that parenthood and raising children is a practice of constantly letting go. What did you have to let go of as you raised your children?
That's a beautiful question, and there's a lot to it. But, I think, you see, my life wasn't just about me anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's about, I might want to do something, but my child has need and maybe not be able to take care of themselves. And so so really being, like the letting go of joining in with the intimacy of being with another human being that is incredibly vulnerable or scared or angry or sad, or how do I learn to be with someone growing up and finding their identity, and how do I, as best I can, not take away their shame. And of course, inevitably, due to my humanness, at times have, given shame. And then coming back and recognizing that and coming back and acknowledging it. And I wouldn't have it any other way. I'm just so grateful that, we had children, and they're now at this point 26 and 21, and have flown the coop, and they're doing their own grand tour of life. And they actually both just came back last night, and we're just so thrilled to have them back home. And so, it's quite a ride to raise children, see them come into adults, and they're, beautiful young men, and just see this development. But yeah, like through the years, there's a lot of letting go. And as a friend of mine once said, he said to me, it was actually a very wise statement. He goes, I hope your kids completely destroy you. And what he meant was destroy the sense of selfishness, destroy the sense of you're here for your kids. It doesn't mean that we can't take care of ourselves at times either, of course, and get breaks and so forth. But my practice of trying to practice unconditional love, how do I learn that? And I may not want to go to the Little League game because I have other things I'd rather do, but this is important, and to go, and then to really join, and to enjoy it, and to be, so anyways, it's a wonderful practice of letting go that has so many deep rewards.
I think there's a lot of letting go of our agendas, right? And our preconceptions and things like that. And you talk about this idea of unconditional love. And I think that this is something that we aspire to so much as parents, and we all think we love our kids unconditionally, but I think that sometimes our kids don't experience our love as unconditional because of how hard it is for parents to be with children when children are having all that bad news, all that anger, fear, pain, etc. And so we, many of us push our children away in those moments, and then our children don't experience our love as unconditional, but as I love you when you're happy. I love you when you're doing well. I love you, So has your practice helped you? And I think this talks directly probably to a lot of the writing. You've talked about coping with panic and anxiety and things like that. So dealing with these difficult feelings in ourselves and in our children, can you talk to me a little bit more about that in the practice of mindfulness?
Can you reframe that? Say that again.
Yeah. So our kids have so many difficult feelings, right? They have their fears, their anxieties, their anger. And because parents have so much difficulty handling that or accepting that, they experience our love as conditional, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering about how maybe in your own life or how you've been able to be with your kids' experience of those strong feelings.
Well, I don't know if this relates to that or not, but my partner, my wife, she's such a wonderful mother, a wonderful human being, but a really incredible mommy. And my boys just adore her. Except when they don't. Just like they adore me, except when they don't. But I mean, there's times when they've just adored her so much, and Dad he's not as high up on the adornment scale as Mom. And so I get to practice not being jealous, or if there is jealousy, to be aware of that and to acknowledge it, and to take the upper road, that I can still just be there and be loving and to hold them and that there was room in our relationship for them to love mommy more than what it appeared to be at the time. That was okay with me. Mm-hmm. And I think that in the long run, they saw that I was there with them no matter what. And I think that they felt very secure in both of our loves, that we would be there for them, even when they preferred one to another. Or when they have a temper tantrum and they're yelling and they're angry, and I would hold on to them and said, I'm just going to try to help keep you safe. And if you're angry, I just want you to support you to be angry, and just feel your anger and acknowledge it. And yes, you can yell, and I'm going to be here with you. And the relationship with pain, I remember one time when my older son was young, we were outside and he fell down some stairs. Fortunately, not a major injury, but it gonked his head, it hurt, he cried. You know, it was a painful moment. And it was so interesting. I remember like a couple of friends running up, and one started pull some candy out of his pocket to give to him, said, okay, little boy, here, have this. And I said to my friend, please don't give him the candy. He gonked his head, it hurt, and well, I'll just be here. And then the other friend came by just a few moments later and started making funny faces and trying to make my son laugh. Like, you'll be okay, little boy. Just laugh. Look at me. You'll be okay. And I said to my friend, thanks for trying to make him feel better. Why don't you go on? My son gonked his head, it hurt. And so then I just sat on the steps with my son, and he said, Daddy, it really hurts when you bonk your head. And I said, Ben, it does hurt when you bonk your head. And he just cried and he roared and he ranted and I said, I'm just going to be with you, and it does hurt, and I'm just right here with you. And he cried, and then gradually in time he stopped crying, and then he looked at me and he said, all right, Dad, I'm ready to go now. And so then we got in the car and we took off, and I never heard him have to reprocess this again. I believe that it was completed at the steps because I honored him with the feelings that he was feeling and let him feel what was there, and it got completed. And you can imagine, if we live in such a pain-denying culture, if I let my friend give him that candy bar, if I let my friend make him laugh, and then he would begin to learn gradually in time that how I deal with my pain, whether it's physical, mental, emotional, is to go eat or to go watch something so that I don't have to feel the feelings. But then, of course, we know what happens when there's so much suppressed emotional feelings and don't know what to do with it. And so wanting also to help to work with my children to become emotionally healthy, to acknowledge the feelings that they're feeling. Now, I realize now with the story, I've deviated greatly from unconditional love. But anyways, here we are.
No, you're talking exactly about it, because you were there for him, regardless of if he was angry and in pain and miserable, right? Like your friends were saying, don't feel that feeling. I'm too uncomfortable with you feeling that feeling. So here, have something sweet, right? And you're saying, whatever the conditions, I love you and I can accept you.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. I love that story. I really appreciate you sharing it with us. So you've written about mindfulness with anxiety and calming panic and things like that. How does mindfulness help us deal with anxiety? And what are healthy ways to be with those feelings in ourselves?
Yeah. Well, there's a few different ways. And, one is, and probably the most important, is to actually become aware that you are actually experiencing anxiety or panic or fear. Because prior to that, being mindful of it, you are most likely just completely lost in it and perseverating and ruminating, catastrophizing. But once you become aware, you've kind of broken that cycle briefly. Like, oh, here's anxiety. So the mindfulness can actually it can interrupt the ruminative or the catastrophizing cycle of things. This is very important to begin to interrupt this, because you're just a sinking ship going down. But once you become aware that you're going down, you have some more resources. Now that you're aware, you have more options to potentially work with it in a more constructive way rather than the way that is not productive, potentially destructive. So the quality of mindfulness itself interrupts that cycle. And now that I'm aware, for example, if I'm holding tightly the steering wheel and I'm white knuckling, I'm just getting stressed out and anxious on the highway. Once I become aware I'm holding tightly, I can release the grip. So there's a very practical element that once I'm aware, I have some choice. And in the sense of mindfulness with anxiety, another quality that can be very helpful is curiosity, is investigation. What's actually going on here that's activating this? that I want to get curious about it. I want to begin to investigate this. And so even the quality of investigation and curiosity is very different than being lost in the rumination, the catastrophizing of what's there. And we may discover that as we become interested in it, we begin to learn about it, and perhaps that can begin to abate our anxiety. Now, there's also some physiological things in the mindfulness practice that can be also very helpful, such as when you see that you're anxious, often with anxiety, your breath is more irregular, it's rapid. And so by working with regulating the breath, will bring a sense of more calmness. And so sometimes we'll suggest to do diaphragmatic breathing, or breathing from the abdomen, breathing normally and naturally, and feeling the belly expanding on an inhalation and contracting on an exhalation. As we begin to regulate our breath, naturally the body becomes more back into balance, and that can potentially help to curb some of the anxiety. That's why sometimes we'll say that the breath can be helpful. But I also think it's very helpful to begin to understand what's actually fueling and driving the anxiety, to begin to bring investigation and inquiry. And there's also another sense that's, I think, very important of the heart, of the qualities of compassion, of kindness, and particularly of connection. For most of us, fear is also around separation, not being connected. And so opening into the web of life, opening into, even as I breathe this air, it's actually an incredible gift from the plant world. And our exhalation in reciprocation is our gift back to the plant world, that we are part of the family of things, that the ground that we're sitting on is holding us, the air that we breathe, that we are part of this world. Most of the time when we're anxious or scared, we've lost that sense of connection and interconnection with the web of life. We are separate, we are alone, and we are disconnected. And so sometimes just these practices of the web of life, of reconnecting with ourselves, with our environment, with this world, with this universe, can be incredibly restoring. And, there's, in some ways, there's no greater power than love. Just like light, a candle illuminated in the darkness of the night dispels all the darkness immediately around it, so too love dispels fear. Love dispels pain. Love dispels separation and disconnection. It's bringing our sense of connection back, this web of life, opening into this heart with compassion. And I know it's not easy when we're in a very anxious cycle. So these practices are our practices that help to train ourselves to come back into the moment, to be with our breath, to honor what's there, to perhaps at times investigate what's fueling and driving that anxiety. And perhaps remembering again this web of life, that we are part of the family of things.
There's so much there that you've shared that I really love. And it's interesting because as a practitioner and a teacher, that you have so much experience, and you also teach mindfulness-based stress reduction, bringing mindfulness to everyone in so many ways. I'm wondering about what you think, Bob, about the idea, the Buddhist teaching of that there is no separate self, that there is no single sense of self that is separate from everything else. That is something that is also changing, as well as all the world is also changing. You're talking about this idea of this interconnection, that we're part of the web of life. Does that teaching of no separate self, do you bring that to your lay audience, and do you find that is helpful for people to understand some idea of this teaching?
Absolutely, because to me this is the most liberative teaching of all of the teachings within the Dharma. And so, but how I present it, I feel, is in a very practical and understandable way. And all too often in Buddhism, there's a kind of a mysticism around the sense of no self. And of course, this is so contrary to the hallmark of Western civilization, declaring, I think, therefore I am. And we're such an individual culture, and of course, name and fame and so forth. But all too often, sometimes within the Buddhist literature, the translations of non-self can leave one kind of confused, perplexed. It's not that clear. And so this is my understanding of it. And it's often not talked in this way, but this is what makes the most sense to me. And, it's actually a beautiful teaching or we actually, I don't know if you'd call it a teaching. There's a reference, it's called the lion's roar. And the lion's roar is when the Buddha awakened, when he experienced enlightenment. And there's this beautiful kind of exclamation, but someday it's known as the lion's roar of his awakening. And in it, he says that he's experienced the unconditioned. And so I want to play off that if there is indeed an unconditioned, then it points to that there must be a condition. So you experience the unconditioned from the conditioned. And so if we look at conditioning from a Buddhist psychological sense, it's speaking about our story, our narrative, our sense of self. And of course, within the teachings in Buddhist psychology, the most potent causes of suffering is, number one, ignorance or unawareness, and that gives rise to greed and hatred and ignorance, to greed and hatred. And of course, in the Buddhist teachings of the Four Noble Truths, the first is this understanding of suffering, and the second has to do with causes. The causes of suffering is, number one, again, ignorance, but also giving rise to craving. And craving is kind of like this belief that I can find happiness through sensual delights, or through being someone, or to feel nothing. And so this is based on this misconception that somehow that I can find happiness and peace outside of me. And this is perhaps why addictive behavior is so strong, because a lot of these sensual delights, or when you get feelings of being powerful and famous, or you want to just bury yourself and not see anything, you lose your sense of self. Particularly with sensual delights, or to be someone, there's this great pleasure and there's hungering for more. But the thing is, we experience it for a moment, but then it goes away. It goes away. It goes away. It does not last. But that's what the addictive nature is. It's yearning to feel good, to have pleasure, to lose oneself. And so the question I think that Buddha is really looking at, and he began to see through these, and began to see that if you really want deep happiness, it needs to be discovered inside your own heart. And that these stories that I've been telling is, again, we come back to the sense of conditioning, the sense of our story, the sense of our identity. Our identity has developed through these years to develop into looking for love in all the wrong places, for looking for sensual delight to be fulfilled, but I just can't get no satisfaction no matter how much I try. And so I think the great discovery is beginning to see that this narrative-based self, this identity, this personality, I believe that the teachings of non-self is seeing through this narrative, seeing through this sense of looking for love elsewhere rather than inside your own heart. That to me, this is the very powerful teaching of what it means, like breaking through the conditioning. And of course, the opposite of conditioning, if you look at it, if the roots of all suffering is greed, hatred, and ignorance, the opposites of that, from greed, is contentment and ease. The opposite of hatred is the heart, compassion, loving kindness. The heart of ignorance, the opposite, is clarity, understanding suffering, its causes, and the pathway to freedom, the Four Noble Truths, the great discoveries of the Buddha. And so, to me, this non-self is breaking through, seeing through this narrative, this story, these limited definitions of self that have enslaved us.
Yeah. So it's interesting because as you speak, I'm translating that into the sense of like ourselves as parents and the difficulties and the struggles that we have, is that if we can take that moment that you're talking about to pause and kind of notice, what is the story that I'm living in, right? What is this story that I'm telling myself that is causing me so much suffering, right? Lack of understanding maybe in what's really happening, wanting things to be a different way, all that stuff. Then as if we can just notice that this is the story that's coming from inside our heads, then the possibility for ease and contentment and clarity is there.
That's right, because once we begin to see the stories, we can begin to see where we get caught, where we're holding on, where we're pushing away, and we can begin to investigate those, and there's possibilities of deeper freedom. Beginning to see through the stories that enslave us. This is the teachings. And this is where we can experience deeper and deeper freedom.
I love this. Well, I'm so glad I have had this opportunity to talk with you, Bob. I really, really enjoy hearing your wisdom and your experience and your voice. And I encourage everyone to check out. Bob has books, many books that are wonderful. Living with Your Heart Wide Open, Calming the Rush of Panic, and others. And Bob, how can people reach out to you if they want to find out more about the work you're doing or anything that you're up to? How can they find you on the internet?
Yeah, thank you. I actually have a website. It's mindfulnessprograms.com. So that's probably an easy way to find where I'm doing things and teaching retreats and so forth.
I would love to come. I want to come someday, Bob. Let me get out there.
I'd love to have you.
Yay. Well, thank you so much for talking to us.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me and taking interest in this work of the heart. And I'm happy for all of you that are listening to this. May we all find the gateways into our heart in a time that we live in such a divided, polarized way. And of course, we're entering into our holiday time, though I don't know when listeners will listen to this, but perhaps peace begins at the dinner table, even with our family or friends that might have voted differently. Like, how can we begin to find our way together?
Yes, I love it. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Bob Stahl. He's amazing, right? Isn't it amazing that the power, right? The power of mindfulness and how that practice helps parenting, helps anxiety, loss, so much. It's amazing. So I just want to remind you, we're starting out my group coaching program, Mindful Mama Transformation Coaching Group. And if you are ready for a sisterhood, you're ready for transformation, you're ready to invest your energy and your time into really just making those important changes in your life that you are ready to make. I am ready to connect with you and to have the great honor of walking you through this journey with a group of other women. It's so powerful. So if that's for you, please check it out at mindfulmamamentor.com/group coaching. That's mindfulmamamentor.com/group coaching. Or if you have any questions about that, or if you have any questions about this episode, you can always email me at hunter@mindfulmamamentor.com. And I'm wishing you a beautiful, wonderful week. I'm wishing you peace. I'm wishing you joy. I'm wishing you some spaciousness and all of that good stuff. Namaste.